What's up and good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Comparative Politics. It is an election day. It's a huge day. In my personal opinion, it should be a national holiday and we should all have the day off so that we can go vote. But we can't have everything we want. Even so, I hope that you are going out and voting early and voting often and participating and getting involved. There's a good chance that many of you have voted already because of the record number of mail-in ballots. Either way, I think that we're better off if we vote in large numbers, regardless of who you want to win. So I'm happy that you're here today, even though it's election day, and even though I think we should be at home and able to vote freely. We will make the most of our discussion. We're talking about political parties and the roles of political parties. We're talking about party systems as well and why some countries have more parties and why some countries have fewer parties. And the plan for today is to talk about the role of social divisions and then also the role of electoral institutions in shaping the number of parties in a given system. And so this has us talking about not just social cleavages and ethnic and religious and linguistic and cultural differences, but also talking about electoral institutions and the way that votes are counted and the way that seats in offices are divvied up after the election is over. And so what's interesting is that what we'll discuss today does relate to today's election, specifically in terms of the electoral institutions and the way the votes and the seats will be counted and divvied up, but also in terms of the number of parties. And so very happy that you're here today. Very excited to get started. I know that we have been very busy in this class, and coming to lecture is always an opportunity for us to sit back and engage without being on necessarily the whole time. So thank you for being here. Before we get started, I want to take a look at the chat. Jose points out that the polling place in his area was packed today in the morning. Jorge had the same experience. This is the sense I'm getting from a lot of people that in particular, in certain types of districts, it's more difficult than others to go and vote and to vote quickly. And so, I empathize with you. I'm sorry that you're waiting. I think that that's a travesty. Voting should be easy. And I think a national holiday for voting would make it easier for us to vote at a time that works well for us. And maybe we could avoid that congestion. It's certainly something that is worth considering and discussing. I wish we could have a whole debate about that. Rady says, I wish I could vote. I wish you could too, Rady. I'm sorry about that. Let's get started. We talked about political parties and we defined political parties as groups of people who seek to attain office and then stay in power once they win office. And one role of parties is to represent groups in society. Different groups often have their own party, or different parties will represent different groups. And these groups, in the differences between them, often break down along familiar lines. So we know about, for instance, an urban-rural cleavage, where urban and rural voters might tend to gravitate towards different parties, or parties might represent urban voters and some parties might represent rural voters. We know about parties that might represent religious groups or might represent differences between different confessional groups. We know that there's often a distinction between more secularist and more clerical groups who want to separate church and state versus groups who want to unify church and state. Different parties will often represent those groups. We know that there are class cleavages that relate to, for example, the difference between capitalists and workers or employers and workers. If you have a job, if you've ever had a job, you know that your boss or your manager or whoever it is who gives you orders has a different set of interests and responsibilities than you do. And in particular, if you've ever met the owner of the company or the organization that you work for, you know that they have a different set of interests too. It's very possible that they might, belong to a different political party than you. This is another important difference. We know that there's a post-materialist cleavage that might relate to different jobs or functions in society of different groups. And then, of course, there are ethnic and linguistic cleavages. In many countries, there are ethnic parties or parties that represent particular ethnic groups. And these parties can break down, of course, along ethnic lines or linguistic lines or cultural lines. Sometimes even regional lines can be relevant. The question, though, why do these cleavages exist, is the most important question. And we can think about, for instance, why is there one party for workers and one party for capitalists? Why don't they belong to the same party? Why isn't it the case that secular and more clerical oriented groups belong to the same party? Why do urban and rural voters belong to different parties? Why do the Democrats tend to represent urban voters, and why do the Republicans tend to represent rural voters? This question forces us to think about identity formation. And this is where we begin to get into the question of identity and conceptions of identity and how people relate to the larger group and who they identify with or associate with for whatever reason, be it a linguistic or an ethnic reason or a sort of regional or a functional reason, maybe related to the kind of work they do, their role in or their position in the economy. The point that we have to emphasize is that individuals are multifaceted and they have many different attributes that make them eligible for membership in some category. Think about yourself, for example. You might be a religious person, but you might also live in a city. You might be a capital owner, or maybe you are a worker. Maybe you are bilingual and your ethnicity or your language matter a great deal to you. And maybe all of these characteristics influence your political identity. It's possible that there are other characteristics that might reflect your identity or make you think about yourself as a person. These different attributes can be many and multiple, and they might make you eligible for membership in any number of identity categories. These attributes can take on different values, and they are given and self-evident in the sense that if you're a worker, you're a worker. If you're a capital owner or an owner of the means of production, you are a capital owner or the owner of the means of production. These things are self-evident and valued on their face. They are given. If you speak multiple languages, including Spanish, English, and maybe even indigenous languages, you are an individual who has a wide variety of different attributes, and it's self-evident that you are a multilingual person. These different characteristics can represent attributes that become politically salient for individuals. And more generally, we can think about identity categories as groups or social groups that individuals place themselves in. And so these categories might include like workers, capital owners, Spanish speakers, Northerners, Southerners, Westerners, Easterners, Midwesterners, mountaineers, fishermen, and so on and so forth, right? We can think of any number of categories. What these categories all have in common is that they are socially constructed. We conceive of and construct those categories that we place ourselves in. And what that means is it's a product of this intricate process of social creation and imagination. We imagine ourselves to be collectively connected because of the fact that we live in the West or the fact that we live on the West Coast. We imagine ourselves to be connected because we're all workers who are seeking to improve our wages or get better benefits from our employer. We socially construct these categories that we place ourselves in, and identity is itself a social construction. And so these cleavages, these attributes become political when they become politically salient for us and when we place ourselves in those categories. And so, for instance, we might think about attributes like class or skin color or nationality or profession or region or origin or height. And those different attributes can take on different values. So for instance, in the attribute class, you might take on the value of a worker or a capital owner, or the bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie as this table calls it. In terms of skin color, you might be black or white. Maybe you are mixed race and you don't necessarily fit into one of those categories, and maybe that becomes important for you. In terms of nationality, we can imagine English American or Nigerian or Ethiopian or Salvadoran or Mexican or Honduran, and so on and so forth. Maybe if profession is the attribute class that matters, maybe you're a political scientist like me, or you're a plumber or a doctor. Maybe you're a lawyer. Maybe you're a garbage person, or maybe you're a janitor or a teacher, or maybe a cafeteria worker. Maybe in terms of region, you think of north, south, east, or west, or midwest, or southeast. Maybe in terms of origin, we distinguish between foreign or native. In terms of height, we think about tall or short, and so on and so forth. All of these different values represent the different ways that the attributes can go. And these different individual attributes can all become important politically because they can take on political importance in the context of parties, in party politics, in the ways that parties represent different groups for political reasons. So let's take a hypothetical and think about a hypothetical country that is divided in terms of region and in terms of language. In this case, we have two attributes. We have region and language. North and South are the attribute values for region. French and Dutch are the attribute values for language. Now, when we have these two attributes and these four values, we have together four possible combinations of attributes. Now, in this hypothetical country, who you are becomes associated with both region and language, because you can, for example, be a French speaker in the North, a French speaker in the South, a Dutch speaker in the North, or a Dutch speaker in the South. And so you begin to see then how different attributes and different attribute values can align or cross-cut so as to create different identity formations or different groups, so to speak. Northern French speakers, Southern French speakers, Northern Dutch speakers, Southern Dutch speakers. In this hypothetical country, the two key attributes are region and language, and where you fall in terms of your region and language will then determine who you are, who your identity is, and then in turn, what political parties will become important as vehicles for representing those groups. Now, as you'll see later on in the discussion today, there's also an important role for electoral institutions, because both social cleavages as well as electoral institutions shape the incentives of both voters and parties. And we'll see how those two things work together later. But for now, I want you to focus on identity formation and the ways that different attributes and different attribute values can create different groups or different identity groups. And I want you to think about your own experience and your own attributes and maybe the values that your attributes take. And I want you to think about what is important for you. Now, in that hypothetical example that I gave you, we didn't actually indicate the relative distribution of the different types of speakers in the different groups. So notice that we have four groups, A, B, C, and D. And for all intents and purposes, we can assume that they are equally represented or equally numerous, meaning maybe the French speakers in the North are 25%, the Southern French speakers are 25%, the Northern Dutch speakers are 25%, the Southern Dutch speakers are 25%. But in the real world, how the attributes map onto actual identity depends on the distribution of the attributes. So it's actually unlikely that any given country will have a perfect, evenly distributed sort of set of speakers in attribute groups. It's unlikely that those distributions will be even in the different categories. It's more likely that some attribute class in some values will be more numerous than others and better represented than others in terms of the overall size of those attributes in the individuals in that group. And when it comes to this, we begin to talk about cleavages. And a country with uncorrelated attributes, that is, attributes that don't align, have cross-cutting cleavages. And so this is, for example, a cross-cutting cleavage. We see that French speakers are divided between the North and the South. Dutch speakers are divided between the North and the South. But a country with correlated attributes has reinforcing cleavages. And so that would be, for instance, all French speakers being concentrated in the North, all Dutch speakers being concentrated in the South. Now, how attributes map onto identity depends upon the distribution of those attributes. And so it can vary considerably from country to country. And this is one way we begin to see how countries go such different ways in terms of their number of parties, in terms of the cleavages that matter a great deal. So in this case, we have cross-cutting attributes. This is that first example that I gave you, that hypothetical example. We have even distribution of attributes across the four categories, 25% for each one. And so what this means is that the cleavages North versus South and French-speaking versus Dutch-speaking are as equally likely to be activated as the four-way cleavage. And so we can think about, for instance, French speakers in the South, French speakers in the North, Dutch speakers in the North, Dutch speakers in the South. These are cross-cutting attributes. They don't correlate. They cut against each other. And we have an even distribution of them across the four attribute values. In this situation, we have a relatively even set of attributes. And what this means is that there are likely to be parties that emerge that represent French speakers in the North, French speakers in the South, Dutch speakers in the North, Dutch speakers in the South. But we can also imagine that there can be a different distribution of those attributes. If we move away from our hypothetical that gives an even distribution, we focus on something more like this, where barely 3% of French speakers are in the North, 36% of French speakers are in the South. Excuse me, let me actually go back. 3% of voters are French speakers in the North, 36% of French speakers are in the South, 57% of voters are Dutch speakers in the North, and 4% of voters are Dutch speakers in the South. We have these four different attribute values and these two different attributes. Now, in this situation, all of these cleavages are likely to be activated or likely to become politically salient or politically important because they're all evenly distributed, as I pointed out. But in this situation, they're not evenly distributed. Instead, there are far more Southern French speakers and far more Northern Dutch speakers than there are Northern French speakers and Southern Dutch speakers. And so in this situation, which identity categories are likely to be activated among these four categories? Can anyone tell us which ones are likely to be activated? Alexis is all over it and points out, well, actually, hold on. Alexis is correct, but I want to see if anyone else wants to try this too before looking at what Alexis says, and maybe before adding additional comments. This is a good little exercise to do on your own or in your head, because it gets us thinking about what we're discussing. Because this lecture is a little bit longer, let me go ahead and engage directly with Alexis. So Alexis points out that the identity categories that are likely to be activated are French Southerners, this category right here, which is 36% of the voters, and Northern Dutch speakers right here, which is 57% of the voters. Stephen says it would mostly be the Northern Dutch because they make up over 50% of the voters. So Stephen adds a little bit more detail, pointing out that the Dutch speakers actually form a larger majority or a larger share of the total electorate. That's absolutely true. Rady says, so majority would determine your group? I'm a little confused. No, Rady, so what we're asking is, based on the distribution of these attributes, which groups will be politically activated, or which ones will become politically consequential based upon the distribution that we see here. Rady, let me know if you're still confused. I'm happy to address this further. Anna Martha says the Dutch speaker. But Anna Martha, does that include Southern Dutch speakers, or do we just mean Northern Dutch speakers? Because Dutch speakers in the South are a little smaller in terms of their overall share of the population. Alejandra says, good, Anna Martha, you got it. Alejandra says French Northerners and Dutch Southerners are minorities. Good, Alejandra. So what does that mean then? Does that mean that those French Northerners and Dutch Southerners will be politically activated by, say, parties or politicians? Or is it more likely that the French Southerners and the Dutch Northerners would be politically activated by politicians or parties based upon the size of the groups and the distribution of the attributes? That's a good question, Kevin. I think that it is relevant to ask, are the Northern Dutch speakers together because they are Dutch speakers or because they're in the North? I think that's an important question to ask. I think for hypothetical purposes, let's just assume that the different attributes have equal influence or an equal weight in terms of how they might influence the way that the groups think about their identity. Alexis points out that because the size of the Northern French and the Southern Dutch is low, their ability to politically organize, or the likelihood of them doing so, is low. Good, Alexis, because they're very small, right? It's a small share of the overall population. And so that means their capacity to organize themselves and be effective politically might be limited. And moreover, it's probably the case that parties would be unwilling to reach out to them because they're so small and because they might not be politically useful. Good, Kevin. I'm glad to hear that. Everett says, I believe we should consider if there are other variables that can activate the French Northerners and Southern Dutch speakers. Fair, Efren, fair. But consider also, given their size relative to the other group, I want to focus on their size in how their size might affect whether a party or a politician would view them as politically beneficial or politically useful. Really, we're thinking about the size of these groups depending upon the distribution of the attribute values. We're getting a lot of really good input here, and I'm very happy to see that you're thinking about this critically. I'm very happy to see that we're also generally kind of in agreement about which groups will become politically activated, and that is to say will become politically consequential or important for a party given their size as a share of the overall population. So we have two groups or two identity categories that are likely to be activated. And those groups are the Dutch-speaking Northerners, 50% of the total population or the total electorate, and then the French-speaking Southerners, 36% of the total population. As was pointed out, 57% of the electorate is Dutch-speaking in the North. That's the single largest block. That's going to be the block that will be the most politically useful to a politician. Why? Because that's a big share of the population. And so it makes sense to try to mobilize or activate that category of people. That's the kind of group that you want to create a political party for to represent in this hypothetical scenario. The second group, in the second best distributed identity category, is French Southerners. And look, they represent 36% of the total electorate. It's a smaller share, but it's still a significant share. It's a share that would also be politically useful to a politician or to a party. And so it makes sense in this case to create parties that represent Dutch-speaking Northerners and Southern French speakers, because those are the two biggest blocks of the voting electorate. And so those two blocks will become the most politically consequential, or seem to represent the greatest potential for winning office for either a candidate or a party. And so when I say politically activated, what I'm referring to is which groups, which categories are the most sort of politically consequential in terms of their size, in terms of their capacity to have an impact, given their size relative to other groups. Now, the question arises, when and why are some cultural differences perceived as politically and socially salient and others not? And when does a cultural difference matter, and when is it ignored? This is a question that's not addressed by what we've discussed so far. So far, we've assumed that all cultural differences can become politically and socially salient. Notice that here we're assuming that both language and region are important, and we're working on the assumption that they're equally important, and therefore the groups that are likely to be activated will be defined based upon language and region. But it's possible that some cultural differences and some attributes don't actually matter. And it's possible that they don't actually shape politics in the way that we anticipate that they might. Then the question becomes, well, when does the cultural difference matter and when is it ignored? When does language matter? When does it not matter? When do ethnic group practices or when do regional differences matter, and when do they not matter? In order to understand this, we have to examine the role of electoral institutions. And this gets us into the ways that votes are counted, in the ways that seats in offices are divvied up after the election is over. And the role of electoral institutions is very, very important because it mediates the link between those social cleavages relating to differences in language or region or ethnicity, and the politicization of those cleavages. And so in the middle, we have electoral institutions that intervene and kind of mediate and shape the extent to which different social cleavages become politically important to parties and candidates and so on and so forth. So whether or not there's a party for Northern Dutch speakers, whether or not there's a party for Southern French speakers, it's going to depend on the impact of electoral institutions. And so electoral institutions primarily relate to the sets of laws that regulate electoral competition between candidates or parties or both. Electoral systems determine how votes are counted and then how offices and seats are divvied up once the votes are counted. And we really distinguish between two types of electoral institutions. We have on the one hand what we call disproportional or single-member district plurality systems. These are often associated with what we call majoritarianism. In a single-member district plurality system, or an SMDP system, individuals cast a single vote for a candidate in a single-member district. The candidate with the most votes wins. Now, in the United States, we have single-member districts. So if you went and voted today, or if you have voted in this election, inevitably you noticed that you cast a single vote for a candidate in a single-member district if you voted for any offices in the Congress. The candidate with the most votes wins. Of course, this also relates to office for the president too. But in this case, we're talking about the representation of parties. And so we're going to talk a lot about the legislature. Now, a proportional representation system, on the other hand, is one that produces a proportional translation of votes into seats. So an SMDP system is one where the candidate with the most votes wins. In the second place candidate, even if they narrowly lost to that first place candidate, that second place candidate doesn't get any representation. The first place candidate, even though they barely won, takes the whole constituency. In a proportional representation system, it works differently. This is one where the legislature is composed of the parties that win a certain proportion of the seats. So usually there's a threshold of 5%. You win as many seats as the proportion of the vote that you won. So in a given district, if there are 5 parties and 5 of those parties win 20% of the vote, each one gets 20% of the seats. It's not winner take all. They divvy up the seats based upon the proportion of the vote that the candidate or the party won. Very different than an SMDP system. These differences matter a great deal because they shape the incentives of both voters and parties. And we're going to talk about how that works. And the way that we'll talk about how that works is by discussing one of the few laws in political science, and that is the law we refer to as Duverger's theory. It's also called Duverger's law. Basically, it says that district magnitude is m plus 1, or the number of parties is equal to m plus 1, m being district magnitude, or the number of, or the number of candidates who win seats in a district plus 1. The question is, why do some countries have many parties while others have few? And the theory goes like this. Social divisions are the main driving force behind party formation. This relates to those distinctions between Northern and Southern French speakers and Northern and Southern Dutch speakers. But electoral institutions influence how those social divisions are translated into parties. And so whether or not those social divisions become important depends on the way that institutions are set up and how they translate divisions into parties. So the more social cleavages there are in a country, and the more these cleavages are cross-cutting, the greater the demand for distinctive representation. So where you have divisions between French speakers and Dutch speakers, between Northerners and Southerners, and where those different categories are equally well distributed, there's a greater demand for distinctive representation. And there's a greater demand for political parties in turn, because each one of those different groups will have a different identity and will place themselves in a different identity category. So for instance, in this case, all of these different categories are equally well represented. We have Catholics and Protestants when in the European group, Catholics and Protestants in the indigenous group. And then we have divisions between the rich and the poor. And what we see is that all of these different categories are equally well represented in terms of the share of the overall electorate that they form. 12.5% Catholics are rich, 12.5% Protestants are rich, and so on and so forth. Each of these different categories forms 12.5% of the overall electorate, or their overall constituency. And in total, they equal 50% total. Catholics and Protestants are both 25% in the European category. Catholics and Protestants are both 25% in the indigenous category. This is a situation where there's a demand for distinctive representation for all of these individual groups. All of these individual groups are likely to have or demand political representation in the form of a party that represents rich Catholics who are European, in the form of a party that represents rich Catholics who are indigenous, and so on and so forth. Taken together, what that means then is we have a demand for 8 parties total. Now, if you look at a different distribution of attribute values, one where Europeans are concentrated in the categories of rich Catholics and rich Protestants, and where indigenous are concentrated in the categories of rich Catholics and rich Protestants, you have less demand for distinctive representation. Whereas here you have a demand for 8 parties total, here you have a demand for 4 parties total, because you have fewer categories that are well represented or that are large relative to the other categories. So what we can say then is country B generates less demand for distinctive representation. And in this case, we expect 4 parties total, whereas in this case, we should expect 8 parties total. This shows you that the demand for representation will depend upon those cross-cutting cleavages and the extent to which cleavages align or cut across each other. Now, social cleavages create the demand for parties, but it's the institutions that determine whether this latent demand for representation actually leads to the creation of parties. How is that the case? How is it the case that institutions intervene to sort of determine whether this demand for representation actually leads to the creation of parties? Remember that I told you that institutions matter because they shape the incentives of both voters and politicians, or those individuals who seek to win office. And the key point that we're going to begin with and develop is that non-proportional electoral systems, so the SMDP system, the single member district system that I mentioned, it acts on the brake, as a brake on the tendency for social cleavages to be translated into new parties. And the reason is because it denies representation to minorities. In a single member district, winner-take-all system, only one candidate or one party wins and takes the whole constituency. That creates an incentive not to create parties that don't have a chance to win office. Let's unravel this and discuss this further. The main point that we're beginning with is that non-proportional electoral systems, winner-take-all systems, in other words, are a deterrent. They act as a brake on the tendency for these cleavages to be translated into new parties. There are 2 ways that this happens. 2 ways that non-proportional electoral systems act as this brake on these tendencies for social cleavages to be translated into new parties. The first one is a mechanical effect. And this refers to the way that votes are translated into seats. Obviously, in a winner-take-all single-member district system, the candidate who wins the most votes wins and takes the whole constituency. That means everyone else, even if they narrowly lost to that first-place candidate, gets no representation or gets no seats in that district. There's also a strategic effect, though, that refers to the way that voters vote for the candidate who has the most realistic chance of winning. Think about it. When you go to the polls today or previously or whenever, you might like the Green Party, you might like the Socialist Party, but it's very unlikely that you will vote for either of those 2 parties. Why? Because in our system, we have winner-take-all elections where the winner of a district, the party or the candidate who wins, takes the whole constituency. And so therefore, you're only likely to vote for one of the 2 parties who has the most realistic chance of winning, because you know that the 3rd and the 4th party are unlikely to win, and therefore you will be wasting your vote if you cast your vote in favor of those parties. Instead, you want to vote for those parties that have a realistic shot at winning so that you don't waste your vote. This is the strategic effect. So in disproportional systems, the mechanical effect punishes small parties and rewards big parties. And I want to show you the way that this works. So notice, for example, that in this case, this is the St. Ives constituency in the United Kingdom. And we notice that in this election, David Harris, representing the Conservatives, wins 24,528 votes in about 43% of the vote. Andrew George, representing the Liberal Democrats, gets about 22,883 votes and about 40.1% of the vote. Now, notice that the next 2 candidates win a much smaller share of the vote. They win 16% and 1% respectively. Andrew George gets 2nd place with almost the same percentage of the vote as Harris, but only one candidate is elected. Who is elected? Harris is elected because Harris won the largest share of the vote. It's a single-member district system, and so this means that Harris is elected. Now, at the national level, in the United Kingdom, we can take a look at the total share of seats across the entire parliament. And we find that after all the individual districts are counted up, the conservatives win a larger share of seats than the percent of the vote that they won, even though they narrowly defeated the Labor Party in terms of, well, they won pretty handily over the Labor Party. But in a related sense, other parties won about 5% of the vote, but got fewer than 4% of the seats. This is possible in a single member district system because individual districts, remember that you only have to win the largest share of the vote to actually win. So what that means then is that in some districts, other parties did win and won by larger margins and therefore won a larger percentage of the vote, but might still win fewer seats. This is an example of a single member district system where only a single member is elected and where representation depends on parties and their performance in these single member districts at both the district level and the national level. Now, the strategic effect relates to how votes are translated into seats. And it relates to how the way that votes are translated into seats influences the strategic behavior of voters and political elites. I already told you that in systems that are disproportional, the mechanical effect tends to reward large parties and punish small parties. Because remember that only the large parties are competitive enough to actually win the race. And so those large parties are going to be rewarded because they only have to narrowly defeat a second place party in order to win the whole constituency. But small parties, on the other hand, are going to be disadvantaged because they might win a relatively large share of that district, but if they lose, they're still going to get no seats at all. In this way, small parties are punished, big parties are rewarded. But voters are aware of this. And so in your case, if you like the Green Party or the Socialist Party, you're not going to vote for those parties. You might. Maybe you're a diehard and you will vote for those parties. Maybe you even write in Donald Daffy Duck on the ballot or something. But for the most part, you still know that you have an incentive to vote for parties that have a shot at winning and parties that have a realistic chance at winning. This is an incentive to engage in what we call strategic voting. You have an incentive to engage in strategic voting because you don't want to waste your vote. You don't want to vote for a party that is unlikely to win. But political elites work the same way. They have an incentive to engage in strategic entry. Their thinking is along these lines. I don't want to form a small party because I won't have a chance at winning in a single member district. Instead, I should try to run with a large party that already exists, or I should try to form a party that can take over an existing large party. It might be easier to just join a large party that already exists. This is strategic entry. Let's boil this down to its simplest possible terms. When you go to the polls and you think carefully about how to best use your vote, you're engaging in strategic voting. And this essentially means voting for your most preferred candidate who has a realistic chance of winning. What is a realistic chance of winning? It basically means the top two parties, right? It means the two parties who are the most competitive and the most likely to win. In this country, that means the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. That excludes the Green Party, the Socialist Party, the Bull Moose Party, if it still exists, and a whole number of other small parties that do exist, but don't have a realistic chance of winning. Now, strategic entry, on the other hand, refers to the decision by elites and political entrepreneurs to run under the label of their most preferred party or under the label of their most preferred party that has a realistic shot at winning. And so if you're a politician in the United States, you might believe that the Green Party represents your policy preferences most effectively. But if you're a politician, are you going to run with the Green Party? Probably not, right? Didn't Jill Stein run with the Green Party? She's probably the most popular politician from any third party in recent memory. But Jill Stein was never very successful politically, never won office. Instead, she was sort of always kind of a maverick. The point is, there are very few Jill Steins, because those politicians who want to win office are more likely to side with the Democrats or the Republicans. So that might be a little unappetizing if you don't like the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. But realistically speaking, if you're a politician, you need to run with one of those parties if you want to win office, even if you agree with the Green Party more than you agree with the Democrats. And so this is the way that electoral institutions will shape the incentives of politicians as well as the incentives of voters. Anna Martha says, are the small parties considered as distractors? Not really, Anna Martha, because small parties exist and can have an effect if they can change or shape the agenda or move the agenda of big parties, if they can also be effective politically, if they can win seats in Congress or office, that can also help to reshape the positions of bigger parties who have to respond to them. I think that small parties aren't necessarily distractors. Rady says, I think they are considered actual parties, but because of a lack of support, they don't get to office. Yeah, that's right, Rady. That's right. And that lack of support is going to be shaped by strategic voting, right? Because voters will cast ballots based upon the idea they have regarding who will win, right? We always have a sense of who will win and who will not win. And we engage in strategic voting when we act based upon that assessment. Jake asks, do you think ranked choice voting would help smaller parties grow in popularity? Without a doubt, of course. And we'll talk more about ranked choice voting in different ways of counting votes in voting when we discuss electoral systems this week and next week. And in different electoral systems in different types of vote counting matter a great deal because they do affect the incentives that different parties have. In the United States, we have fully majoritarian institutions. We have single member districts. And so I've used this example over and over, but there's a reason that the Green Party and the Socialist Party don't have any seats in Congress. It's because the strategic dimension of our electoral system presents voters and parties with the incentive to sort of team up and vote for the parties that have the most realistic shot at winning. Rady says, I also think that parties in power may adopt some of the ideas that third parties are promoting in order to stay in power and have more supporters. That's exactly right, Rady. So that's the thing. Even though, the question is always, why run for office under a third party? Why run for office if you're a third party? Well, the reason is because you can reshape the positions of those big parties, and because those big parties might also cooperate with you if they believe that they can gain some of the support that you already have, or if they can benefit from adopting your ideas. Sometimes parties will also merge. Sometimes small parties will merge with bigger parties. And so there are reasons for those small parties to exist, and they can also have an impact beyond the election, even if they don't win seats. And so, there's never really a good reason not to form a party, right? There are reasons to believe that certain parties will win and certain parties will not, based upon the size of the parties and the social cleavages in the electoral institutions. But in all countries, political parties are a form of association that is really important, and parties can have an impact beyond just elections in democratic institutions. So let's do a little exercise. The question that I want to ask you is, in a single member system, this majoritarian disproportional system, how would you vote if you lived in the St. Ives constituency in the 1992 elections and had a reasonably accurate forecast of the election outcome? Now, your preference order is the following. You like the Labor Party most of all. You like the Liberal Democrats second of all. And you like the Conservatives third of all. Now, let's look at this. Your preference order, as a reminder, is first, you like Labor, second, you like the Liberal Democrats, and third, you like the Conservatives. How are you going to vote? let's assume that going into the election, you have a reasonably good idea who is going to win or who has a realistic chance of winning. Now, based upon your preference order and based upon the type of electoral system, the single member disproportional system, who would you vote for? And let's again use the chat. Message me either privately or message the class. And I'd like you to take a moment and engage with this and think about strategic voting.
Professor, I just have a quick question about one party.
Yes, Efren.
What is the Labor Party like? How is its stance? Like, I don't know about the Labor Party at all.
So labor parties traditionally are workers' parties that kind of are like leftist or left center. In a lot of countries, they might become more centrist over time, but they tend to represent working in like lower or middle classes. And that was the original purpose of the Workers' Party in the UK. But that's usually, so for example, in Brazil, the Workers' Party, the PT, is a leftist center-left party. Good. So we got some responses rolling in. I anticipate we'll get some more here as we go along. Don't be afraid to take a moment and think about this. Remember your preference order and remember that the single member disproportional system will present you with certain incentives as a strategic voter. Who will you vote for? Stephen. Okay, so I'm gonna chill for a moment and let people come in with their responses because I don't want to give it away yet. Good. I'm seeing a lot of consistency here with the responses. Very happy with that. Keep them coming. Good, good. I can see already that you all know how to engage in strategic voting. Good, good. Getting a lot of good responses. Great. And I'm also hearing from a wide range of students, and that's always excellent. I want to generate as many opportunities for us all to participate as possible. Good. Good job, everybody. We're doing good. So let me wait a little bit more and see if we can get a few more. I hear you, Jake. Yeah, it's always like sort of tortured making these choices, right? And Adriana seconds Jake's point, which I'd imagine is a point shared by many of you. And I'll empathize with you. And Jake says Bernie 2020. Okay, so let me begin to engage with these responses. So Jorge says liberal Democrat because they have the better chance at actually winning. And Jorge had this response immediately. And Jorge noticed that, look, Labor is my first choice, right? I want the Labor Party to win. But look at Labor. They didn't do so well. And we should have known going into the election that they weren't that competitive and that they wouldn't win. And so, because it's a disproportional system, I will waste my vote if I vote for Labor and expect them to not be competitive. Instead, I should vote for really the party among the two most competitive parties that is the closest to my first preference. And so what that means then is I should vote for the Liberal Democrat, right? Because my preference order is first Labor, second Liberal Democrat, third Conservative. Now, the Conservative, we might have known would be more likely to win, but we probably knew that the Liberal Democrat was going to be very competitive. The Liberal Democrat is my second preference. Since the Liberal Democrat Party was going to be among the two competitive parties in this constituency, I'm going to strategically vote for the Liberal Democrat. I can't vote for Labor because that would waste my vote. They're not going to be competitive. I go to my second preference, I'll vote for the Liberal Democrat. But let's assume that my Liberal Democrat preference is also not likely to pan out because the Liberal Democrats aren't expected to be competitive either. Say maybe the Liberal Party is expected to be one of the two most competitive parties along with the Conservative Party. In that case, I would vote for the Conservative Party. I would have to go to my third preference because only one of my preferences was among the two parties most likely to be competitive in the election. And so this is the nature of strategic voting, right? We're thinking about, well, what party that's the closest to my first preference has the most chance at winning the election? And in this case, it's the Liberal Democrat. Stevens says, like Grady says, either the Conservative or the Liberal Democrats, as they make up the majority of the votes. Stephen, we would probably vote for the Liberal Democrat first, right? Because it's our second preference, whereas our Conservative Party is our third preference. And so even if we think that they're both equally likely to win, we would probably cast our ballot in favor of the Liberal Democrat because we think that they are more preferable than the Conservative Party. Kevin points out the Liberal Democrat. Yeah, absolutely. And Nina says, I would vote for Andrew George because the number of votes between conservatives and liberals is not too far apart. And Nina pointing out that if my first preference was the Labor Party, I would not vote for the Labor Party because the Labor Party does not do well, is not expected to do well. Instead, I would vote for the Liberal Democrat because that's my second preference, and they're likely to be very competitive along with the conservatives. But I like that Nina said I would vote for the Liberal Democrat as opposed to the Conservative because the Liberal Democrat is my second choice, the Conservatives are my third choice. Kevin says I would vote for Andrew George. Alejandro says the Liberal Democrat. Good. Alexis says, I mean, I would vote for whichever I feel would do the least harm, mainly because I don't hold major parties in high regard, but I feel that the Conservative Party can do disproportionately more damage. I would vote for the party that has the highest likelihood of preventing that. So I understand your reasoning, Alexis, but I think that our reasoning from the point of view of strategic voting should be, well, the conservatives are my third preference. The Liberal Democrats are my second preference. The Liberal Democrats and the conservatives are the only two preferences of mine that are competitive and that are likely to win. And so therefore I should vote for the first or the top preference of mine that's likely to win, and that's the Liberal Democrat. So maybe kind of putting aside our expectation about how the conservatives might govern and thinking about how can I strategically use my vote to vote for the party that I most prefer that's most likely to win, that would put us with the Liberal Democrat. And so you might arrive at Liberal Democrat with your reasoning here, but we want to think about how strategic voting might let us arrive at that conclusion more so than maybe how we expect the parties to govern. Anna Martha says Liberal Democrat, Tiffany, Liberal Democrat, David, also Liberal Democrat. We're getting a lot of consistency here. Daniel, Caesar, Jake, who says in a tortured twist, I would vote for the Liberal Democrat because it's my way to avoid the least favorite option. Good reasoning. Adriana agrees. Kevin points out that, yeah, if the third party growth is really small, it's hard to vote for them, right? Because you know that Green Party or that Socialist Party won't win, right? And so you're not going to vote for them. And Efren adds, from the data, it seems that the Conservative Party can win. However, it's important to know that some votes from either party can gain seats. My preference is the Labor Party, Liberal Democrat, Conservative. But Efren, just to pick on you a little bit because you're so often contributing in class, we know that the Labor Party going into the election might not be competitive, right? So if it's a single member district plurality system that's going to punish smaller parties and really only give two parties a shot at winning, well, that means then that those parties that are unlikely to win, even if we prefer them, we should not vote for them. That includes the Labor Party, because look, the Labor Party is not likely to win. If we have an idea that they're only likely to win less than half of the largest vote share, we don't want to vote for them because that vote that we cast in favor of the Labor Party will sort of be wasted. Instead, we should vote for the two parties that are the least likely or the most likely to win. And then among those two parties, we should pick the one that we prefer the most, and that's the Liberal Democratic Party. So I think that your preference order, it is a preference order that we might have if we don't have a sense of who the competitive parties are. But once we have a sense of who the competitive parties are and the way the election outcome might go, well, then maybe we should think carefully about how we're voting. Now, let's think about this from the perspective of a politician. Now, you are a political entrepreneur or a politician, and you have an interest in environmental politics. You want to promote an agenda of environmental protection, but you have a dilemma. And the dilemma is that the Green Party probably comes closest to sharing your policy preferences, but you will not get elected given the use of the single member district plurality system. The reason is because the Green Party is a small party, and it's unlikely to be among the two most competitive parties in any given district. This is a problem because now you've got a question. Can I better further my policy agenda by running with the Green Party or by running with a different party? What do you think? Tell us in the chat. So you are an aspiring politician who wants to promote environmental protection. You like the Green Party, but you're unlikely to get elected if you run with the Green Party because the single member district plurality system gives the full constituency to the top vote getter in each district, as opposed to divvying up seats proportionally. Can you better further your policy agenda by running with the Green Party or by running with a different party? Think about this carefully. Good, we're getting some responses rolling in. I like this because now we're thinking about strategic entry. We were thinking about strategic voting before. Now we're thinking about strategic entry. We went from voters to politicians. Alexis says, running with a different party as the likelihood of success is higher with a more competitive platform. Yeah, so the Green Party is not a competitive party. We know that it's unlikely to win any seats. And so even though the Green Party best represents our policy agenda, and even though running with a different party would probably require us to make some compromises regarding our agenda, we're actually more likely to win with a different party because it's probably more competitive. And so we should run with a different party. Steven says, I feel that you could further your agenda with another party because with the larger parties, you gain more traction and that allows you to gain the votes. Right, exactly. You've got to win the votes in order to actually get into office and promote that agenda. And so the Green Party, even though it's the best vehicle for your actual agenda, ideologically speaking, the best vehicle for your agenda, politically speaking, might be a party that's more competitive, right? Alejandra says, it's better to run with a major party, one that aligns with environmental protection. Yeah, or maybe even you're willing to compromise a little bit, right? And maybe you're willing to run with a bigger party that's got a more general agenda that may sort of be compatible with environmental protection, but that may not favor it to the extent that the Green Party does. Because in the end, what really matters is winning the votes and getting the seats, right? So you're beginning to see how politicians think, and you're beginning to see how the agenda of a politician can be influenced by both ideological considerations, but also institutional ones, right? Relating to the likelihood of success under different party umbrellas. Kevin says, or would it be better if everyone didn't go to a major party? That would take a lot of effort though. But remember, Kevin, that the institutions present incentives that give politicians reasons to team up and form large parties, right? Because if the if the electoral system gives the full constituency to the party or the candidate who wins the most votes, that means then parties and candidates have have an incentive to merge and to come together and to form larger parties. I think that those incentives are hard to overcome. And I think that this helps us to understand why, for example, the US has only two parties, because we have majoritarian, winner take all, single member districts where the whole constituency goes to the party or the candidate who wins the most votes. And Kevin points out accurately that would take a lot of effort though, right? And it would take finding a way to reshape the incentives of the politicians, and maybe we would have to change the institutions. And I don't know how we could do away with major parties, right? Maybe there will always be large parties. Jake says, I think the best option might be to run with the most powerful party that most closely aligns with your beliefs. The first goal is to get elected at all so that you can either push your party towards your goal or create conditions within the system that allow for the growth of smaller parties. The best time to build smaller parties isn't during the time of an election because it's usually too late by then. Good. So Jake really captures in a beautiful way the kind of competing priorities of politicians. Even those Jill Steins, who are the most ideologically pure, although there's some debate about that because some money that she got disappeared. I'll leave that for a different day. Even those candidates who are the most ideologically driven also face a powerful incentive to try to do what's politically the best, right? How do I get elected? Even if I have an ideology, if I don't get elected, I can't ever translate my ideology into a policy agenda and then a program. I've got to get elected first. And so there's this balancing act, right? There are these competing priorities. I have my ideology on the one hand, but I have my political priority on the other hand. And so maybe I kind of moderate my ideology and my positions so that I can align with a major party so I can win office. Then maybe I can pull the party to the left. Then maybe I can create conditions for the growth of smaller parties. But I've got to get elected in the first place. And so now we're beginning to think like a politician. You're starting to see how politicians have competing priorities. They have different masters, if you will. Efren says the individual should run with a different party because of the SMD electoral system. In the future, the individual would observe the platform of the Green Party because we don't know if there's a high favorability for them. For example, the individual elected from a powerful party can later boost smaller parties. Good, Efren, good. So like Jake said, and like Efren agrees and kind of adds and embellishes further, look, even if you want to promote third parties, and even if you want to drag some of these big parties to the left or to the right, you are better off trying to do so through one of those big parties in the first place. So maybe you try to get inside the system so you can change the system. Maybe you try to get inside the party so that you can pull it to the left, so that you can change its agenda, so that you can promote environmental protection from within the party. And then maybe eventually you can strengthen a third party that would do a better job of promoting that agenda. This is the way that politicians think. These are the ways that they reconcile these competing priorities. And I'm so happy to see that you're thinking in the way that a politician thinks, in the way that they kind of engage in this balancing act between ideology on the one hand and politics on the other hand. Anna Martha says, I like the Green Party, but choose a major party will be the better option. Good. And so even those of us who admire those smaller third parties, we also recognize that we don't have much of a shot at winning under SMDP rules if we don't team up or join one of those bigger parties. Good. Very good. Now, so far, we've been talking about majoritarian, winner-take-all, single-member district systems like the United States, the UK. But the truth is that these types of electoral institutions don't exist everywhere. And in fact, proportional representation is usually more common. And politicians in proportional systems do not face this trade-off. The reason is because seats are divvied up and offices are divvied up according to the proportion of the vote that parties and politicians won. Even a small amount of electoral success in these systems can usually get you some legislative seats. Often there's a small threshold that you have to cross. In Germany, for example, it's 5%. But assuming you cross that threshold, even small parties can get seats. And this means then that there can be many more parties in the legislature and many more parties in coalitions. And in particular, small parties can also become kingmakers. That is, they can become the small party that rounds out a winning coalition that's necessary to support a government. And in that regard, they can have tremendous influence because they can come and go and they can make or break governments. Now, disproportional systems, on the other hand, as we saw, mean that small parties are less likely to attract good candidates and resources and less likely to form in the first place. So there's this key difference, right? Proportional systems do a good job supporting smaller parties because small parties can gain seats according to the proportion of the vote that they receive. That means those small parties are more likely to form. That means that those small parties are more likely to get good candidates. That means that those small parties are also likely to get more resources. And in the end, they're more likely to get seats. In disproportional systems, doesn't work that way. Those small parties are not likely to get good candidates. They're not likely to get a lot of resources, and they're not likely to win either, because only the two most competitive parties will vie for the seats or the seat in that district. At the national level, only those two most competitive parties will ultimately have seats. Listen, everybody, we're out of time. I wanted to get through as much of this as we could. We do still have some more, and that's okay. We'll finish this up on Thursday. I do anticipate that I'll have to remake the syllabus and kind of change the course schedule a little bit because we're a little bit behind, but it shouldn't be a big problem, and I can easily do that. But I'll see you again on Thursday. We'll finish up with parties, and then we'll continue discussing electoral systems. So I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you very much for being here. Go out and vote if you haven't already. It was great to see you, and have a good day.